The spring of 1945 brought a sound that echoed across all of Europe. Church bells ringing, rifles fired into the air, banners declaring peace at last. For millions, it was the end of 6 years of devastation. Families embraced in the rubble, soldiers laid down their arms, and the world exhaled. But for a certain group of young German women standing in the shadows of a railway yard, liberation had a very different meaning. They weren't going home. They weren't celebrating. They were being herded onto trains, not as victors, not even as ordinary civilians, but as prisoners. Their uniforms were faded remnants of the Reich's auxiliary services, green-gray skirts and jackets that had once been crisp and new, now torn and threadbare. Their boots were cracked, their hair unwashed after weeks of retreat. Some were barely 20 years old, their faces still carrying traces of youthful softness beneath the layers of soot, dust, and exhaustion. They were secretaries, radio operators, typists, nurses, the background machinery of the Nazi war effort. They had watched the Reich chew up everything in its path, and now they were watching it collapse in their hands. As they boarded the train cars, silence hung over them. Not the silence of peace, but of dread. Whispers passed through the group like a chill. "The Americans won't spare us," a girl from Hamburg murmured to her companion. "They will make examples of us." She had heard the warning from a Luftwaffe officer during the chaos of surrender. Another woman, taller, her face hardened by years of operating anti-aircraft searchlights, said nothing, but her clenched jaw told its own story. For years, they had been told that Americans were wolves, that captivity would mean humiliation, cruelty, perhaps worse. And now, as the train began its slow journey westward, the women sat pressed against one another, bracing themselves for a nightmare they believed was inevitable. The countryside outside the windows was a wasteland. Charred towns drifted past like ghosts, churches without steeples, factories reduced to skeletons, bridges collapsed into rivers. Children waved weakly from embankments, their faces pale and hollow from hunger. Inside the cars, the women shivered against the wooden walls. At night, when the train stopped, they huddled together for warmth, listening to the crunch of boots outside and the distant crack of gunfire. They whispered about what awaited them across the Atlantic. Would they be paraded in front of American crowds? Would they be forced into hard labor until they collapsed? One of them, Anna, a secretary from Munich who had hidden a small diary inside her coat, wrote a trembling line under the dim light of a cigarette ember. "We are being taken far. None knows where. My mother will think I am dead." Perhaps I will be. Little did she know that what awaited them would not be cruelty, but something far stranger. A world so different, so abundant, and at times so unexpectedly humane that it would leave them more shaken than punishment ever could. The sound of liberation had rung for millions. For these women, it was the sound of chains, yet the story of what they found on the other side was only just beginning. Among the women packed into that darkened train car, one would emerge in memory, not because she was a soldier, nor because she held rank, but because she wrote. Her name was Anna, a 21-year-old secretary from Munich. Anna had been like so many young German women, ambitious enough to leave home, obedient enough to follow orders, and naive enough to believe the promises of her government. Before the war, she had dreamed of working in a law office, perhaps even studying at the university if her family could afford it. But when the Reich called, she became part of the administrative machine, typing orders, filing reports, relaying messages to officers who hardly looked at her face. Now, her once sharp uniforms were reduced to tatters, her hands blistered and raw from weeks of marching and chaos. Yet inside her coat, hidden in the lining, she carried something precious, a small leather-bound diary. It was not an act of defiance, nor a political statement. For Anna, it was survival. Writing was how she made sense of a world that no longer made sense. She had begun it years earlier, scribbling lines about her hometown, about her father who owned a small workshop, about her mother's Sunday meals, and her younger brother who dreamed of becoming a teacher. But as the war dragged on, the entries grew darker. Air raids, shortages, evacuations. By the spring of 1945, the diary had become less a record of life and more a confession of despair. In the cramped space of the train, Anna pressed the tiny notebook against her knees, writing by the flicker of a smuggled match. Her handwriting was shaky, her words crowded together, but her thoughts were clear. We are told we go to America. I cannot imagine it. We hear they are cruel. We hear they laugh at us. Perhaps they will starve us. Perhaps we will never see home again. I pray my mother does not believe me dead. Her words carried what many of the others could not say aloud, the gnawing fear of the unknown. Around her, the women whispered about rumors they had heard. Some believed the Americans would shave their heads as humiliation. Others spoke of labor camps worse than Siberia. But Anna's thoughts went deeper. She wondered what kind of people these Americans were. She had been told all her life that they were decadent, weak, barely civilized. Yet even as she wrote, doubts crept in. Could a weak people have defeated the mighty Wehrmacht? Could a decadent land have pushed Germany back on every front? The diary became a mirror of her transformation, though she did not yet know it. In time, her pages would capture astonishment, gratitude, and a slow crumbling of everything she thought she understood. For now, Anna was just one face among many, sitting on a wooden bench as the train rattled toward the ports. But through her eyes, through her pen, history would be preserved, not of generals or battles, but of ordinary women whose captivity revealed truths that propaganda had tried to bury. When the train jolted to a halt at a ruined station, Anna closed the diary and tucked it back into her coat. She stared out at the blackened ruins of a church, its steeple blown away. For the first time, she felt that Germany itself looked like her own life, once whole, now broken, uncertain if it could ever be rebuilt. The whistle blew, the train lurched forward, and Anna tightened her grip on the diary. She could not know it then, but the journey across the ocean would soon test every fear she had, and show her things she would never have believed if she hadn't written them down herself. The train rattled westward, its iron wheels grinding over tracks that had once carried German troops to the front. Now, instead of soldiers, it carried young women whose war had ended not with victory, but with surrender and captivity. Anna sat pressed against the wooden wall, her knees drawn up, the diary hidden beneath her skirt. Through the cracks in the slats, she watched Germany pass by, or what was left of it. The land was a graveyard. Burned-out houses leaned like broken teeth against the horizon. Bridges lay twisted in rivers, their steel frames jutting upward like skeletons. Factories smoldered, their chimneys silent, their machines stripped or buried under rubble. Churches stood without roofs or steeples, their bells long gone, melted down for the war effort. At every stop, children appeared along the embankments. Thin, hollow-eyed, some barefoot, they waved with hands like twigs. A few held scraps of bread as if afraid to let go. Others scavenged in the ash beside the tracks. The women in the train cars turned away, ashamed to look too long. It was too much like looking into a mirror of their own despair. One woman from Hamburg whispered bitterly, "This is what victory brought us. Ruins for our children. Shame for us." But another, hardened by years of manning a searchlight battery, muttered, "Do not pity them. Pity us. We are the ones going west." Her jaw was clenched, but her eyes betrayed fear. Rumors ran through the cars like wildfire. Some said the trains were bound for camps in France, others that ships would take them across the ocean. The uncertainty gnawed at every thought. None dared to hope for kindness. Anna listened in silence, her hand resting on the diary hidden in her coat. She wanted to believe she would one day return home, to Munich, to the cobblestone streets of her childhood. But the country outside her window seemed unrecognizable, stripped of everything that had once made it a nation. At Bremen, the train rolled into a station half collapsed by bombing. There, American guards ordered the women off. They stumbled onto the platform, dragging battered suitcases, clutching rosaries, ration tins, or nothing at all. For a moment, Anna thought of her mother's face, imagined her searching the crowds, but the station was silent except for boots, barking orders, and the shuffle of weary feet. The women were marched toward the harbor. Ahead, the masts of ships pierced the gray sky, American flags snapping in the wind. The sight struck them harder than any insult could have. The enemy's banner now fluttered above them, not as rumor, not as propaganda, but as their new reality. Some stared in defiance, others in disbelief. One young nurse burst into quiet tears, the sound quickly swallowed by the roar of engines. Anna clutched her diary close. She wrote a single sentence that night while huddled in a warehouse waiting to be processed. "We thought the ruins were the end, but no. The end is yet to come, and it sails under the stars and stripes." As dawn broke, the women were herded toward the gangways. The Atlantic lay before them, vast and merciless. The ships that once carried American soldiers to war would now carry their captives into the unknown. The Reich had promised them 1,000 years of glory. What they faced instead was an ocean of uncertainty. The ship's engines thundered to life, their vibrations rolling through the steel decks as the gangway was pulled away. The German women crowded against the railings, staring back at the shrinking shoreline of Europe. Their homeland, bombed-out cities, silent churches, blackened ruins, faded into the mist. Ahead stretched nothing but the Atlantic, wide and endless, and beyond it the mysterious enemy they had been taught to fear. The vessel itself was overwhelming. It was no passenger liner, but a liberty ship built for war. Its steel bulk smelled of oil and salt. Its narrow passageways echoed with boots and orders in English. For many of the women, this was their first time at sea. Within hours, seasickness spread. The constant roll of the waves turned stomachs inside out. Some lay in their bunks clutching tin pails. Others tried to steady themselves by gripping railings until their knuckles went white. But seasickness was not the greatest shock. That came at mealtime. In a steel mess hall below deck, the women were handed trays. They moved slowly through a line, expecting thin gruel, maybe cabbage soup. Instead, steaming mugs of coffee were poured before them, thick, black, and strong. On their trays landed slabs of meat, slices of soft bread, even butter. For years they had eaten ersatz bread made of sawdust and barley, watered-down soup, and cabbage stalks when they were lucky. Now, before their eyes, was food that looked almost unreal. Some hesitated to eat, whispering that it could be poisoned, but hunger won, and one by one they lifted the bread to their lips. The taste was almost unbearable in its simplicity. Real flour, real yeast, real food. One young woman burst into tears, holding the bread in both hands as though it were a treasure. Another whispered, half in awe, half in disbelief, "They feed us as they feed themselves." Anna recorded the moment in her diary. "I do not understand this. We are enemies, and yet they give us meat, coffee, and bread. Not once in the last year did I see food like this in Munich. It frightens me more than cruelty would have." The bunks in the hold were stacked 3 high, the air thick with salt and diesel fumes. The women lay awake at night, rocked by the endless waves. Some prayed, others whispered in the dark. A few clung to the stories they had been told, that this was only a trick, that the Americans would show their cruelty soon enough. But doubt had begun to creep in. The food, the orderliness, the strange indifference of their guards. It did not match the picture painted by Nazi propaganda. One night, when the ship rolled in a storm and the women clung to their bunks as water dripped through the hatches, Anna wrote a line that spoke for them all. "The ocean is vast, and so is the fear inside me. Yet I begin to wonder, what if America is not the place we were told? What if it is something else entirely? After weeks at sea, a murmur spread through the ship. Land was near. The women crowded the deck again, clutching the rails with pale hands, seasick but alert. The grey horizon began to shift. Slowly, shapes rose, towers, buildings, whole skylines untouched by bombs. And then, the unmistakable silhouette, the Statue of Liberty. No one cheered, no one smiled. To them, it was not a beacon of hope, but a cold reminder that their world was gone and a new one was about to begin. Dawn broke over the Atlantic with a pale golden light, and with it came a ripple of whispers across the deck. The ship had slowed. The endless grey horizon had changed. Shadows of land now stretched faintly against the rising sun. The women crowded toward the railings, their fingers white on the cold steel. What they saw stole the breath from their lungs. New York. Skyscrapers pierced the morning mist, tall and gleaming, their windows reflecting the sun, as though the city itself were made of fire and glass. Bridges stretched across the water like steel ribbons, unbroken, unharmed. The harbor was alive with ferries, tugboats, and cargo ships, horns sounding in the distance. To women who had only known the ruins of Europe, it looked less like a city and more like another world. Anna pressed her diary against the railing, scribbling as fast as her shaking hands allowed. Our cities are rubble, ours are hollow shells of stone, but here nothing has fallen. It is whole, untouched, like a dream. I cannot understand how this can be. And then, rising above the waves, they saw her, the Statue of Liberty, her torch raised high, her crown sharp against the morning sky. To immigrants, she had been a promise. To refugees, a symbol of hope. But to these women, prisoners of war, she was something else entirely, a reminder of defeat. No one smiled, no one cheered. Instead, the women stood silent, each wrapped in her own thoughts. One whispered bitterly, "They show us their statue as if to say, 'You have no freedom.'" Another simply wept, the tears streaming down her face as the ship glided past the towering figure. The harbor itself was alive with energy. Crowds lined the piers. Some jeered, some only stared in curiosity. For the women, every eye felt like judgment. They stepped down the gangways, boots clattering against wooden planks, the smell of salt air mixed with coal smoke and the strange sweetness of roasting peanuts drifting from vendors nearby. Everything was overwhelming. The air itself felt different, cleaner, sharper, without the sting of burning ash that had clung to German skies. Children played along the docks. Bicycles whirred past in the streets beyond. Houses stood whole with white porches and painted fences. For women who had watched their own cities burn under Allied bombs, it was almost incomprehensible. How could this enemy, painted as weak and decadent, stand untouched, prosperous, alive, while their own homeland lay in ruins? The realization sank deep, heavier than chains. Germany had promised them victory. What it had given them instead was rubble. America, the enemy, stood before them not only undefeated, but thriving. Anna wrote one final line before they were herded onto buses bound for the interior. "We are not just prisoners of war. We are prisoners of a truth we cannot deny. Our world has collapsed, and theirs has endured." As the buses rumbled away from the harbor, the women clutched their belongings, staring out the windows. The road stretched ahead, flanked by neat houses and green fields, a landscape that looked more like a painting than reality. For the first time, the thought stirred among them. Perhaps the enemy was not what they had been told. Perhaps the true shock of captivity would not be cruelty, but the unbearable sight of abundance. The buses rolled for hours, engines humming as the landscape of America unfolded beyond the windows. For women who had grown used to ruins and smoke, the view was disorienting. Green fields stretched wide beneath a summer sky. Farmhouses stood with white porches and tidy gardens. Children rode bicycles along country roads. One whispered almost to herself, "Is this really the land of monsters?" When the convoy finally slowed, the women pressed against the glass. Ahead loomed fences strung with barbed wire, guard towers rising at intervals, soldiers with rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Their hearts sank. Here it was at last, the captivity they had feared. The buses rattled through the gates, raising clouds of pale dust. Inside stretched rows of wooden barracks, painted and neatly aligned. The grounds were swept clean, paths marked with gravel. The women exchanged uneasy glances. This was not the grey brutality of a concentration camp, nor the chaos of German field prisons. It was something strangely orderly. As they stepped off the buses, American officers with clipboards moved briskly down the line. Names were recorded, possessions catalogued, uniforms exchanged for plain work clothes. Each woman was handed a numbered tag. The process was efficient, almost bureaucratic. But still, tension coiled tight in their stomachs. Would the insults come now? The harsh orders, the blows? Instead, the guards spoke with clipped calmness. Their English was softened by accents unfamiliar to German ears, southern drawls, Midwestern flat tones. They barked no slurs, offered no sneers. Their indifference was unsettling. The women were not treated as monsters, nor as guests, but as something in between. Prisoners to be managed, documented, housed. Anna clutched her diary as they were marched past the barracks. Her eyes darted to the fences, the guard towers, the armed soldiers watching from above. Yet something in the atmosphere confused her. She had braced herself for humiliation, degradation, for the cruelty she had been warned about. Instead, she found herself facing silence, paperwork, and an unnerving sense of order. That night, lying on her bunk beneath a thin blanket that smelled faintly of starch, Anna wrote, "They treat us as though we are ordinary. Not as enemies to be broken, nor as allies, but as people who must simply be counted and kept. It is more confusing than hatred would have been." The camp hummed with quiet activity. Guards walked their rounds with rifles slung loosely, not clenched. The women listened to the hum of crickets outside, so different from the thunder of bombs. Somewhere in the distance, a whistle blew to mark the hour. They whispered in the dark, voices low and uncertain. Perhaps the cruelty will come tomorrow. Perhaps this is only a trick. But tomorrow would bring something else entirely, something none of them could have imagined. The next morning, before the women could settle into their new barracks, the guards ordered them into line. They were marched across the camp toward a low building from which steam curled into the air. The line moved slowly, the sound of boots scuffing against gravel, the women whispering anxiously to one another. No one needed to be told what this was. They knew. This was the moment they had feared. The humiliation, the cruelty, the breaking of their spirit. One clutched her suitcase as if it might protect her. Another crossed herself silently, lips moving in prayer. Anna gripped her diary inside her coat, her pulse pounding so hard she could barely breathe. "This is where they will mock us," someone muttered. "This is where they will take our dignity." The building loomed closer, its tiled roof shining faintly in the morning sun. Inside, they could hear the hiss of water, the drip of pipes. Their hearts pounded harder with every step. When Anna's turn came, she stepped into the tiled room, braced for the worst. The guard at the door handed her something heavy. She looked down. A bar of soap, thick, white, smooth. It smelled faintly of flowers. Confused, she clutched it in both hands. A towel followed, then a plain, clean garment. Another woman beside her stared in disbelief, whispering, "Soap. They give us soap?" And then the showers came alive. Streams of hot water cascaded from the pipes, filling the room with steam. For the first time in years, real hot water poured over their skin, washing away months of grime and lice. Some women wept openly, their sobs echoing against the tiles. Others laughed nervously, as if afraid the moment might vanish. They rubbed the soap against their arms, their faces, their hair, astonished that such a simple thing could feel like salvation. Anna stood beneath the water, her tears mingling with the steam. She felt the dirt of war running off her skin, her scalp freed of crawling lice, her body warmed and cleansed in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. That night, her diary entry trembled with emotion. We were told we would be beaten, mocked, broken. Instead, we were given soap. How can this be? I do not understand. My hair is clean, my skin is warm, and I do not feel like a prisoner. I feel human again. When the women emerged from the showers, wrapped in clean garments, their hair damp, their faces flushed from the heat, they looked at one another with wide, bewildered eyes. What had been promised to them as humiliation had become restoration, and that, more than cruelty, unsettled them to the core. The tiled room slowly emptied, the steam clinging to their hair and skin as the women stepped back into the cool air of the barracks yard. Their cheeks were flushed, their eyes red, their hair still damp and fragrant with soap. The guards handed them blankets and directed them back toward their quarters. No words had been shouted, no insults hurled, no humiliation forced upon them. Instead, the women walked away in silence, clutching their clean clothes, dazed by what had just happened. In the barracks, the quiet soon broke. One woman collapsed onto her bunk and began to sob uncontrollably. Another sat beside her and laughed, a nervous, trembling laugh that seemed to have no end. Others whispered to one another in urgent tones, as if the truth was too fragile to be spoken aloud. They gave us hot water, real soap, not the grey paste we had at home. Do you think it was some kind of trick? Anna sat on her bunk, her diary open across her knees. Her hand shook as she wrote, "I still smell the soap on my skin. My hair is clean for the first time in months. I wanted to cry when I touched my own face and felt it smooth again. It frightens me, because it is not cruelty I must endure, but kindness, and kindness is harder to survive." For years, they had been hardened by war, taught to expect only suffering. Cruelty, at least, could be understood. Cruelty could be resisted. But this unexpected decency disarmed them completely. That night, as the camp settled under the hum of crickets and the soft glow of electric lights, the women lay awake in their bunks, whispering across the room. One voice. "I thought they would strip us of dignity. Instead, they gave it back." Another. "Maybe the enemy is not what we were told." The sound of quiet weeping carried through the darkness, but it was not weeping from fear. It was from something deeper, grief mixed with relief, confusion tangled with gratitude. Anna closed her diary and rested her head on the thin pillow. For the first time since the war began, she felt warm, clean, and, if only for a fleeting moment, safe. And as the night stretched on, a thought settled among the women like morning mist. Perhaps captivity would not be defined by hunger or cruelty, but by the slow unraveling of everything they thought they knew. The morning after the showers, the women were led in groups toward a long wooden building with wide doors. The air inside was thick with a smell that made their stomachs twist, rich, warm, mouth-watering. It was the mess hall. The women filed in slowly, their eyes darting across the rows of tables, the trays stacked neatly by the entrance, the steaming pots at the far end of the room. American soldiers stood behind the counters, ladles in hand, waiting without expression. The line crept forward. One by one, trays were filled. First, thick slices of bread, soft, white, and still warm. Not the grey, dense, sawdust-laced loaves of wartime Germany, but bread that seemed impossibly light, with a crust that crackled when touched. Then, real butter, golden and creamy, melting as it touched the bread. Not the greasy margarine substitute they had grown used to, but something richer, something they thought had disappeared from the world. Next came meat, beef stew, thick with chunks of potato and carrot. The smell alone was enough to make some women dizzy. Alongside it, steaming mugs of coffee, strong and black, filled the room with a scent so foreign, so intoxicating that it almost seemed like a dream. For a long moment, many simply stared at their trays. They had expected thin gruel, perhaps cabbage soup, maybe even deliberate humiliation. But this was a feast. Some hesitated to eat. Whispers spread. What if it is poisoned? What if it is just a trick to make us trust them? But hunger overcame fear. The first bites were tentative, then frantic. Women chewed in silence, tears spilling down their cheeks as the taste of real food filled their mouths. Anna, her diary tucked beneath her tray, lifted a spoonful of stew and froze. Her hands trembled. Then she took a bite, and the warmth spread through her chest like fire. She closed her eyes, savoring it. Later she would write, "I had forgotten what food tasted like. Real bread, real butter, real meat. It is not propaganda. It is not illusion." This is how they eat every day. How can such a thing be possible when the rest of the world starves? Across the room, one young woman broke down completely, sobbing into her hands as she clutched her slice of bread. Another laughed nervously, saying, "If this is captivity, then I do not know what freedom is anymore." The mess hall buzzed with the clatter of trays, the scrape of spoons, the quiet astonishment of women who had not eaten like this in years. Each bite was a revelation, each sip of coffee a challenge to everything they had been told about America. When the meal was finished, the women sat in silence, staring at the crumbs left on their trays. No one dared to waste a morsel. That night, Anna wrote one line that seemed to capture the weight of the moment. "I feared chains, but they gave me bread. I feared blows, but they gave me butter. I do not know this enemy anymore." The showers had cleansed their bodies. The food began to cleanse their minds. Days passed in the camp, each one marked by routines that seemed strangely ordinary. Roll call at dawn, work assignments in the gardens or kitchens, letters permitted once a month. None of the brutality they had been warned about. Instead, there was food, hot meals 3 times a day, each more abundant than the last. There was cleanliness, showers available, soap provided, laundry collected and returned. There was even recreation, books, music, a camp orchestra made up of prisoners themselves. And with each passing day, something began to shift inside the women. For years they had been told that Americans were decadent and weak, incapable of fighting, incapable of sacrifice. They had been told that the Reich stood for discipline and order, while the West stood for chaos. Yet here, inside the fences of a prison camp, they saw a different reality. Anna's diary became the record of that awakening. She wrote in careful lines, "Our leaders said the Americans were barbarians, but barbarians do not give soap and hot water. They do not serve bread so white it melts on the tongue. They do not waste coffee on prisoners. If this is weakness, then what is strength?" The other women felt it too. Around the bunks at night, whispers turned into debates. One argued that it was all a trick, that the Americans only wanted to soften them for propaganda. Another snapped back, "Then why feed us like this? Why clothe us? Why waste their bread on us?" The questions dug deep. Each bar of soap, each plate of food, each clean blanket was a chisel hammering at the walls of belief they had carried across the ocean. For some, the cracks widened into shame. They thought of the camps back home, where Jews, Poles, Russians, and countless others had been starved, beaten, and discarded. They thought of what their own country had done to those it called less than human, and now, as prisoners themselves, they were treated with dignity by the very enemy they had been taught to despise. It was not spoken aloud, not yet, but the thought haunted them all. Had they been lied to? Anna's diary confessed it most clearly. The Reich told us the Americans were our doom. Perhaps that was true, but not because of their bombs, not because of their soldiers, because of their abundance, because of their humanity. They destroy us not with cruelty, but with kindness, and I do not know which is harder to bear. In the silence of their bunks, in the quiet of the mess hall, in the warmth of water running over their hands, the women felt something collapse inside them, not their bodies, but their certainty. And once certainty is gone, the world never looks the same again. Weeks turned into months. The barbed wire fences remained, the guard towers still loomed, but the women began to notice what lay beyond them. Through the chain-link gaps, they saw farmers working fields with machines larger than any they had known back home. They saw trucks loaded with food rolling in and out of the camp gates, never empty, never short. They watched guards drinking Coca-Cola from glass bottles, tossing them aside without a second thought. It was not just abundance, it was casual abundance. At first, the women's suspicion lingered. They told themselves it was a trick, that the Americans were showing off their wealth to demoralize them. But the days wore on, and the routine never changed. 3 meals, clean clothes, hot water, medical checkups, even classes for those who wished to learn English or pick up trades. Slowly, the bitterness began to erode. Anna recorded the shift with painful honesty. One evening she wrote, "I cannot pretend any longer." The Americans live as if scarcity does not exist. They waste what we would treasure. They throw away bread crusts we would have fought for. And they treat us, not well, perhaps, but humanely. It is more than our own government ever did. The conversations in the barracks changed too. Where once there had been whispers of fear, now there was reluctant admiration. They build ships faster than we can sink them. They feed their prisoners better than we fed our soldiers. They light their towns at night while ours sit in darkness. The women found themselves marveling at details that seemed trivial but carried immense weight. Electric lights that never flickered, showers that never ran cold, guards who smoked cigarettes endlessly, stubbing them out half-finished. To the Germans, raised on ration cards and shortages, this was not just comfort, it was power. And beneath that recognition lay something more unsettling: respect. Anna captured it in one devastating line of her diary. The Reich promised us 1,000 years, but looking at America, I see now that 1,000 years cannot be built on lies. Strength is not shouting or terror, it is bread, it is soap. It is coffee served without fear of running out. Not every woman admitted it aloud. Some clung fiercely to the propaganda they had been fed, insisting that the Americans were decadent, corrupt, destined to collapse. But even in their voices, there was doubt, and doubt spread faster than certainty. The camp did not break them with violence. It reshaped them with ordinary routines: showers, meals, work, rest. And in that quiet reshaping, America revealed itself not as the monster they expected, but as something more dangerous, an example of what Germany could never be. Winter came to the camp, the fields beyond the barbed wire dusted with snow. The women wore coats issued by the Americans, simple but warm, lined with wool. The barracks smelled faintly of wood smoke and coffee, a scent that no longer startled them but still reminded them of how far they were from home. By now, life in captivity had taken on its own rhythm. They rose to bugle calls, ate meals that remained astonishingly steady, and worked at tasks that gave their days a structure. The fear that had once hung over them like a storm cloud had given way to something quieter, more reflective. Anna's diary, now nearly full, bore witness to the change. Her first pages trembled with fear, confusion, and despair. But the final entries carried a different tone, measured, thoughtful, almost reverent. One evening she wrote, "We came here expecting chains. We expected hunger, humiliation, cruelty. We expected to be reminded of our defeat with every step. Instead, we were given soap, We were given bread. We were given coffee. Small things, perhaps, but they cut deeper than any blow could have. Because they showed us what our own leaders never did, that even an enemy can recognize our humanity. For Anna and the others, the memory of that first shower never faded. The shock of hot water pouring over their shoulders, of real soap lathering their skin, became a symbol far greater than cleanliness. It was the moment their fear began to crumble. The bread and butter in the mess hall carried the same weight. More than food, they were proof that America's power was not only in its bombs and tanks, but in its ability to provide abundance without fear of scarcity. Around the barracks at night, the women still spoke of home, of families scattered, of cities destroyed. But they also spoke of America, quietly, cautiously, as though afraid to give the thought too much power. Perhaps they are not what we were told. Perhaps strength looks like this. Anna closed her diary with a final reflection. I do not know what will become of me, or if I will ever see Munich again. But I know this. When I think of America, I will not think of bombs or battlefields. I will think of soap, of bread, of coffee in a tin mug, and I will know that sometimes kindness is stronger than any weapon. The fences still stood. The guards still patrolled. But in their hearts, something had shifted forever. The war had ended. Yet for these women, the real battle, the battle of belief, had been lost not on the field, but in the shower room, in the mess hall, in the quiet dignity of an unexpected enemy. And that was the lesson of their captivity, that even in war, humanity can be the most disarming force of all. And now I want to hear from you. What do you think? Was it the soap, the bread, or the coffee that truly broke down years of Nazi propaganda? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because these small details often tell the biggest stories. If you enjoyed this journey through one of history's forgotten chapters, give this video a like. It really helps others discover these stories. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We've got so many more untold tales of World War II coming your way, and I'd love for you to be here when we uncover the next one. Until then, keep asking questions, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next story.